one of my favorite things that I get to be a part of are weddings. Now, at one point, I didn't like weddings because I thought that that kind of stuff was gross because I was a typical boy. But as I've matured, I love weddings. And as a pastor, I get to have the front row seat of people's best day of their life. It's fascinating. I usually am standing with the groom as we are waiting for the bride to come down. And there's something incredibly powerful of that moment of anticipation because the entire room is just ready to see her come down. And usually the groom is just a puddle of goo. He's just he's all nervous, whatever. And then the doors open and everybody stands up and turns. People's breath is taken away. She comes down the aisle and everybody looks at her, and I do too. But then I turn and look at him because usually the guy, even if he's 6'7" and hunts and loves to be outside and never cries, the guy's just the whole time, right? And so you're just looking at him and looking at her, and they come down, and the father gives his daughter away in marriage, and there's this moment where it feels like all of creation is just poised on this moment, and everybody is just feeling this beauty that's unfolding before them. And that's why I love weddings. But it is so troubling to me how people can take that moment and the power and beauty and majesty of a moment where two people say, our lives are going to now become one. We will be together forever. And then throw it away. Nobody on their wedding day is you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to burn this thing to the ground. And yet, we find over and over again in our society and our culture the destruction of marriages, families, and lives. It's in that context that we find our story today, our text in Exodus chapter 20, verse 14, the seventh commandment. Let's read it together. It is this: do not commit adultery. Now, this commandment is one that some of you have been oh no, we just talked about murder last week. That was heavy. This week, man, we're going towards adultery. What's he going to say? And it's fair to ask that question. Here's what I've noticed with the Ten Commandments. As we've been walking through them, we've been re-examining them in the light of Jesus' teachings. And we've been saying, what if the Ten Commandments aren't simply a list of do's and don'ts? What if instead they're an invitation to a relationship with God? That God is teaching us how to know him and how to love him and how to love other people. And through these commandments, we find that God's inviting us not to religion, but to relationship. And so what we've seen with the Ten Commandments is that the first four are really focused vertically towards God, that we want to love God with all of our heart, mind, soul, and strength, have no other gods other than him. And then the next six are about loving others. And what I found is that most people aren't going to get too out of shape about loving God, because this is what we do. But loving others, man, we start talking and teaching on these, man, we're getting into people's business, right? Getting right where they live. And in part, living together can sometimes be a very difficult thing, especially in the real world, where we're not just in church and we're all dressed up, but rather when we're getting messy in the streets. And so today I just want to talk about this idea of God calling us to honor marriage and honor our bodies and honor him with the way we live our lives. Because it's in these areas that we find ourselves affected most. In this command, almost more than any others, we can find the destruction of lives and stories and legacies and people's journeys going off the rails. And God gives us this command because he loves us and because he's created us for relationship. And so here, we're going to just take some time and spend the rest of our time today just walking through what it looks like to keep this command, and then also to safeguard our life so that we can have the most fulfilled life possible for us. Because God's ultimately for us. He wants our good. So today, as we look at this passage, let's define what this commandment is. Ultimately, this commandment, the commandment against adultery, is saying to not cheat emotionally or physically on your spouse or with anybody else's spouse. And our culture continues to hold this as a value. Cheating is bad. right? Most people still would say that's true. In fact, the Associated Press did a poll recently where they found that 90% of people believe adultery is morally wrong, which I'm wondering, where are the other 10%? We're like, this is great, right? But 90% of people still believe that's wrong. We see that even in Tiger Woods' story. Remember Tiger on top of the world, crushing every record? Comes out, he's cheating on his wife. He loses every sponsorship that he has. Big corporations just pull their sponsorship from him because they don't want to be associated with someone who cheats on their wife. And yet, what we find is that adultery still happens. Even though 90% of people say, hey, adultery is wrong. There's another study that came out by Buss and Shackelford, which said that roughly 30 to 60% of all married adults, so men and women, 30 to 60% will have an affair at some point in their lifetime. That's staggering. There's a massive disconnect with people who say, I want to be with you forever, and yet then do not follow through, break the relationship. And I believe most people don't enter into a moral failure going, you know what, today I'm just going to set my life on fire. Nobody does that. Nobody's like, I just want to end every relationship that I have. We believe a lie. We believe that nobody is going to know or nobody's going to see or that we're just going to be happier or we just make a mistake and we go off the rails. And you know this. You know, the scriptures are very clear about what adultery does to the person. Proverbs 6:32 says, the one who commits adultery lacks sense, which is the Bible telling you you're an idiot. That's about as rough as it gets, right? And whoever does so destroys himself or herself. Adultery is destructive. And I don't have to tell you that because you have friends that you know who've had an affair and their entire family implodes. Divorce ensues. You know this because you've seen pastors and religious leaders fall. You know this because your parents did, or maybe you did. And you know firsthand the pain and destruction that happens when someone is unfaithful to somebody else. Man, I'm just telling you from the bottom of my heart. If there's one thing I could tell you to be the most vigilant over, is your heart. You know, you may think at the moment, hey, this is going to be fine, it's whatever. I promise you, the pain from being unfaithful and living intimacy outside of God's boundaries will destroy you. And the hard thing is our current moment is headlong towards living a vision for humanity and relationship different than what God has placed in front of us. Here's the deal. God says the way that marriage and relationship should look is one man, one woman for life. That's the only place that you can find physical intimacy. One man, one woman for life. But our culture, because we're in the middle of the sexual revolution, has begun to redefine what it looks like to be in relationship with other people. And in the 60s and 70s, we found the free love movement happening where people are like, no, you can be with whoever you want and there are no consequences. And yet we've seen the full bloom of what that's brought in our culture. You've seen it in the way your family has suffered. Then we've moved forward and now we've begun to redefine marriage. We said, oh, no, it's not just one man, one woman for life. No, you can get divorced, or if you made a mistake, then you can break up and start over again. No, you can actually get married, not just to a woman. You can get married if you're a man to a man, or if you're a woman to a woman. We're going to redefine what marriage even is. And today, that conversation is continuing. And here's the funny thing. I know that some of you guys are like, wow, Mike, you're making this seem like a slippery slope. It's because sometimes slippery slopes are real. And what you find is today the modern discourse is now pivoting towards a complete difference and a redefinition of what marriage is altogether, where polyamory and non-monogamy is starting to enter into the mainstream, where people are saying, no, you don't have to just be married to one person. You could be married to 2 or 3 or 4 and it's okay. You can have an open relationship. And you see this in culture. If you don't believe me, just look at some of the mainline publications that are dropping things out there right now. This is New York Magazine, January 15th, 2024 edition. Polyamory, a practical guide for the curious couple. And it's got cats, because apparently that makes it cuter. Hey, you can be married to multiple people, just like these cats. That's weird, right? All right, here's another one. The New York Times Magazine. So the New York Times has a picture of 4 different people here. And they're like, this is what a relationship could look like for you. Wife and husband. Husband and his girlfriend. Same guy. Wife and her boyfriend. Or, hey, it's us too. So here, you could be with different people, and it's just peachy, right? Next picture. Polyamory has entered the chat. This is Wired Magazine. Mainstream awareness of polyamorous relationships are becoming more widespread on dating apps, making connections, blah, blah, blah. Here's the deal. This is coming. Adultery now is becoming in vogue. And so I think it's important for us to talk about this, because here's the deal on adultery. It is destructive. Those who enter into it destroy themselves and their families and the people they love most. And as we begin talking about this, we need to examine what Jesus says, because that's the central theme in this series. We're saying not just what's happening in Exodus, but what does Jesus have to say about the 10 Commandments? And we find it in Matthew chapter 5. Turn with me there in the New Testament. If you got a copy of the scriptures, if you're new, it's the first book in the New Testament. It's called Matthew. And in Matthew 5, Jesus is preaching his most famous sermon, the Sermon on the Mount. In verse 27, he says this. He says, "You have heard that it was said, 'Do not commit adultery.'" So Jesus references the command. He's like, hey, you guys have all heard this. Don't commit adultery. Verse 28, "But I tell you, everyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart." So Jesus takes the command of a physical command to not commit adultery and then says, we're not just stopping there. We're going to the root cause behind it. What's in your heart? And Jesus says, if you even look at somebody and say, I would rather be with them, it's the same as if you did it. What a radical teaching by Jesus. Jesus is not only here talking about like lust for men, for like an image or for a woman. He's talking about women also wanting a different relationship. And here's what Jesus does. He levels the playing field on adultery, because a lot of us are like, great, adultery. I'm never going to do that. I don't struggle with it. I'm great. I'm never going to have to worry about that. Preach on, Mike. But what the Bible shows us here, what Jesus is getting at, is that all of us do not make God's righteous standard. Every single person in this room has broken this commandment at some point in their life, because we all are never satisfied. We're always looking outside. And Jesus is calling us on it. You see, Christianity is not about a group of religious people who dress right and have all the right answers and are good and perfect, never sin. In fact, if you got to know us better, you'd say, man, y'all are a mess. And that is true. Christians are all a mess. We've all messed up. All of us have a past. In fact, our present's pretty rotten too. But the beauty of what Jesus has offered us is he's offered us a different future and a different identity. And he's spoken over us a different name, that we're not named by our sin, we're named by the Son, Jesus. And that's what we have our hope in, not just what our performance is, but the fact that Jesus Christ has come so that we can have life, because all of us have broken it. We've all messed up. And Jesus offers us something better, a different vision for life. A fact that we can hold to is that our story is not defined by our worst day or our worst moment. It's defined by Jesus. So here's what you find here in this commandment. Even though you've broken it, and even though I've broken it, and we've all messed up, God offers us grace. So if you're feeling the weight of the fact that you've looked at things you shouldn't have, you've fallen again, you've had an affair, God wants to rewrite your story into something beautiful And the way you get there is by choosing. It's choosing to live a life that is not defined by trying to get as much as you can get out of it. It's choosing to live a life that's pursuing God with all of your heart, mind, soul, and strength. And when it comes to temptation, sexual temptation in particular, you need to realize that you can't overcome it by sheer willpower, by being strong or being smart or having all the right information. Sin is an apex predator. It will come and it will devour you. You're not strong enough. There are people who are braver than you, smarter than you, more spiritual than you, know their Bible better than you, have fallen to temptation. And the biblical response to temptation is not strength, it's running. It's fleeing. It's leaving the seed. It's running away. Just like Joseph, when he was tempted, he ran. We too must be the kind of people that run. You know, one of my favorite videos I've seen recently is a video of a penguin who was trying to jump onto an iceberg because he was going to get out of the cold and ran into a leopard seal. Now, I know a lot of you guys don't know what a leopard seal is. A leopard seal is like a seal. Most of us think about seals are like cute and cuddly. A leopard seal is like a lion crossed with a seal. It's an apex predator. It eats penguins for lunch. So check it out. Here we go. All right, here's our leopard seal. Sunning itself. Oh, hey now. You guys want to see that again? Here comes the penguin. Like, hey, I'm just hanging out here. No. Mistake. That's our posture when it comes to temptation. We need to run from it. But what I found is that often when we think about running, we think about just, hey, I'm just going to run away. But you can't change desire by giving it nothing. You have to exchange one desire for a greater desire. So what I'm telling you today is that if you want to overcome temptation, you need to say not only no to some things, you need to say yes to others. You not just run away from temptation, but run to something else. There's three things I want to put in front of you that you need to run to. The first one is you need to run to God. You know, I believe that ultimately sin of every kind is found when we don't really understand God and when we're not pursuing Him and we're not pursuing the one who created us in His image. When we don't have a clear understanding of who God is, we will try to find our satisfaction in somebody or something else. And so we need to be the kind of people who constantly pursue God in His presence. Why? Because He's made us for a purpose and He knows us and loves us deeply. Several years ago, the art scene, which I know a lot of us super into the art scene here, but the art scene was rocked because they discovered a new Leonardo da Vinci painting. Now, da Vinci is famous for the Mona Lisa, perhaps the greatest painter that's ever lived. And every one of his paintings are worth millions and millions of dollars. So having a new one just pop up was a big deal. But at one point, the painting was completely unknown. In fact, somebody owned it in New Orleans. They had bought it for $120 somewhere random and hung it on the hallway of their house. They didn't know what they had. And this painting is called the Christus Mundi, which means the Christ over the world painting. And I actually have a picture of it right here. It kind of looks like the Mona Lisa, doesn't it? And people could recognize the similarities. Some people thought that this was just a fake, or maybe one of Leonardo's students had painted it, but it really wasn't valued very much until an art collector bought it from the couple that had it in their hallway and decided to see if it was worth anything. So he had a restorer come and try to clean it up because it had spaghetti on it and all kinds of stuff like that. So they kind of clean it up a little bit. So they started trying to restore it. And the restorer was a world-class restorer who really specialized in ancient art. And so she kept on trying to work on it, but couldn't get the lips right. So she said, I'm going to go look at the Mona Lisa. So she went look at the Mona Lisa and realized that they were exactly the same, and only one person could have painted them, Da Vinci himself. And so it was taken to an appraiser and put on auction, and it was sold for a record $450 million by Mohammed bin Salman, who's the current king of Saudi Arabia. Which, by the way, is kind of wild that Jesus in his providence has a picture of himself in Saudi Arabia in a castle somewhere. But the one thing that changed was the identity of the person who created the art. God has created you. And you may feel like you're not worth anything. You may feel like you have low self-esteem. You may feel like you're unloved, and so you're trying to find that in somebody else. You may feel like you don't have any value, and so you're trading in your future and your destiny for just a brief moment and an encounter. Why? Because you don't understand who you are. That God has created you for more, and he has put his image on you. And because he's named you and because he's called you to be your own, you matter. So don't put a price tag on yourself. Don't cheapen yourself, because God has declared you to be priceless. And he showed it in the fact that he sent Jesus to die for you. So if you're feeling temptation, run to the one who created you. Why? Because he has placed incredible value on you. So second, I want us to look at the second thing we need to run from. The second thing to run from is to run to your calling. So first, run to God. Second, run to your calling. I believe a lot of us struggle with temptation because we have no calling on our life. Now, God has put a purpose on us. He has a calling for us, but we simply don't know what it is, or we're not running to it. We may be running from it. We may be pursuing happiness. We may be pursuing an experience. We may be pursuing like success in our work, but that's not our calling. God has called us to be worshipers, and he's called us to be people who serve in his kingdom. And absent of that calling, we will cheapen our purpose in life. A big part of your calling is to be the kind of person that is a signpost to the living God. That when people look at your life, they say, man, God must be real because of the way they live. And there's no better platform for that than in marriage and the way that you live your life and what you pursue. Because the world is trying to redefine marriage, and what they're going to find is as you take it away from what God has already declared over us, because we didn't invent marriage, God did. And when we start to break it down into things that it was not meant to do, people are going to realize that it's going to bring them to a place of emptiness. What they thought would be fulfilling is not. And they will look around and see the marriages that are honoring God are working because God created them that way. And when you live your life pursuing your spouse and honoring God in your life, it's a sermon to the world. And it's part of your calling as a person. So pursue your calling. Don't settle for anything else, because your calling gives you great purpose in your life. Which brings us to the third thing you need to run to. If you're going to follow Jesus, you need to run to your spouse. Pursue your spouse. Now, I know there are single people in this room. I just need to hear this. Being single doesn't mean that you're a second-class Christian. You can sometimes feel that way. I mean, I was single as a pastor for a while, and that was really awkward for me. It was kind of hard because most people who become pastors get married when they're in college. It's like ring by spring or money back at all of our colleges that we go to, okay? And it's weird, too, because when you're a single adult, you don't know where you fit. You're like, do I get to be at the grown-up table at Thanksgiving? Because usually you get sent down with the grandchildren, right? You just kind of like, man, I don't know where I fit in this. But being single is not a life sentence, and it's not what defines you. And if you're single today, and you hear me say you got to run to your spouse, I encourage you, if you have a desire to get married, get married. But if you don't, that's okay too, because you have a greater calling in your life than simply to have a family and get married. Your calling ultimately is to worship and glorify God with all of your life, whatever he puts in front of you. And then if you're pursuing him, my best advice to you is then just look around, see who else is pursuing him too, and go, how you doing, right? It's probably the best way. You'll find you have more in common with somebody pursuing Jesus than if you guys like the same kind of shoes or like the same kind of vacations. Why? Because there's something greater. A purpose is uniting you where you say, we can glorify God more together than apart. That's what we want when we say, like, go find somebody that really will be a good complement to you. It's because you're saying we can do more for Jesus than we can do apart. But I find it so sad sometimes where you find young men and young women who live their entire life just hoping that they'll get married. And once they get married, they just move on to other things. Like when I was a kid, I was terrified of the rapture, not because I was going to go see Jesus, but because it meant that I wasn't going to get married. Like I used to pray, like, God, just wait until I can get married, and then you can come, you know? And I had this prayer. I don't know, maybe I was the only one who grew up in Christian subculture who prayed that, but I did, because I was like, I wanted to get married. And then I got married, and I realized that I was still the same person, and I still needed to pursue my spouse. You see, when you get married, it's not like a finish line. It's the beginning of a new race. And if you're not going to chase your spouse with the same passion and desire, you're going to end up just being roommates with a side project of kids. And when you have kids, I'm telling you, it just becomes a place at some point where you're just like the Uber driver to their best life. Like that's what you're doing all the time. And that's not what anybody signed up for when they're at the altar, right? And you begin drifting apart slowly and slowly and slowly. And unless you pursue your spouse, unless you chase them, you're going to end up heading towards disaster. So if you're married in this room, my invitation to you is to pursue your spouse, both of you, with the same passion, even greater passion than you did with the first time that you got that message from them, or they asked you out, or you went on that first date, to pursue them and to intentionally set time aside so that you can look at each other in the face and go, this is why I married you. Like Tabitha and I like to take trips sometimes without the kids. Why? Because we get to sleep in, yes. We also get to sit and talk and connect. That's one of the reasons why on Fridays we don't schedule a lot. It's my day off and Tabitha's off, and we go on dates together because we know we have to invest in this relationship or it's not going to be what God intended. And the same thing is true for you. You have to pour your heart's desire into the relationship because you're going to have desire. You're going to have passion. And when it's unchecked, it's going to find a way to be fulfilled. But you have the ability to channel it into your relationship. And when you do, you're going to find that your marriage will become something that you've only dreamed of. And it starts by saying, I want to pursue my spouse. Now, listen, hear me out. You may be at a place where you're like, yeah, but my story is a mess. And my parents were a mess, and they screwed up, and I don't want to do that. And so I'm scared, and I hedge my bets, and I guard my heart. Or you might go, yeah, but I do have an addiction. I look at things I shouldn't. Or I had an affair. Actually, or even some of you may be like, I'm actually currently in one. My spouse doesn't know. What do you want me to do, Mike? Listen, my hope for you is joy, that God will rewrite your story. And what I want for you is I want you to hear what Jesus said to somebody who was brought to him in the act of adultery. There's a woman in John chapter 8 that the Pharisees bring to him. And they say, Jesus, what are you going to do with her? Because we caught her in the act of adultery. Now, we don't know where the guy is, but we do know that they do bring her. And they're hoping that Jesus is going to say, you should stone her to death. Because that was the penalty for adultery in Jesus' day. So they're all waiting. And Jesus crouches down in the dirt and begins to write. Scholars have had a lot of ideas as to what he wrote. Nobody really knows. But we do know what he says, and that's the most important part. Jesus says this. He says, let the one who is among you without sin throw the first stone. And one by one, everybody leaves. And Jesus is alone with the woman. Imagine what she's thinking. She's like, my life is over. Everybody knows. I'm so ashamed. And Jesus looks at her and says, where are your accusers? She says, Lord, they've all left. Jesus told her, "Neither do I accuse you. Go and sin no more." You know, Jesus is the only one who could have thrown a stone. He's the only one who had the right to, because he had never sinned. But he wasn't holding any stones. And he invited her to a new future, one where she would be free from her past and be free to live a new life. And he invited her to leave it behind and sin no more. And it all came to be possible in her life because she acknowledged Jesus as her Lord. She said, "Lord, they're God." There's this moment where she goes, I know who you are and I know who I am. And today, that is available for you. We're not going to invite people to come up front today. But right where you are, you can do business with God. If you do want to talk to somebody, there'll be people around. You can talk to me afterwards, talk to somebody else if you need help. But these two questions are the ones I want to leave with you today. First one is this: God, what do I need to run from? You might be redlining in your relationship. You know it. You haven't been willing to face it, but you got some stuff you got to run from. Unchecked sin in your life. You know, R.G. Lee said this about sin. Said, sin will take you farther away than you want to go. Sin will keep you longer than you want to stay. And sin will cost you more than you want to pay. Sin is coming for you. You need to run from it. And you need to be ruthless with it, because sin will be ruthless with you. It will destroy your life. So some of us need to run. And you ask the question, God, what do you want me to run from? But then there's others who need to ask the second question. What do I need to run to? Is it running to Jesus? Running to your calling? Running to your spouse? I'm telling you, if you press into this, your life is going to change. I'm going to just take a moment to pray, and then you can just sit in the moment for just a second. God, thank you for grace. All of us fall short. But you have come so that we can have a life and a second chance. So God, for anybody in this room who needs a second chance, who's far from home, who's teetering on the edge, who's lost their way, who's lost their faith, God, I pray that they would find you who give life and hope. God, I pray for today that there would be healing. We would not be defined from our past, but instead, we'll press into a glorious future. Because you are the restorer of brokenness. You give life and hope. Jesus, we love you. Thank you for watching today. Please hit subscribe to be notified when we share new uplifting content that will encourage you and help you grow in your faith. And click the link on the screen to get connected and support how God is using this ministry to bless people across the United States and help us with our mission to create a community alight with Jesus.